Professor of Film and Television Studies and Associate Dean at the UCLA School of Theater, Film and Television. And today she will address the phenomenology and history of moving image media in relation to the technologically mediated perception and its transformation of cultural understandings of space, time, and embodiment. Her extensive list of publications includes Address of the Eye, a phenomenology of film experience, screening space, the American science fiction film metamorphing, visual transformation and the culture of quick change, the persistence of history, cinema, television, and the modern event, and an introduction to film. Today, her talk is called Nostalgia for a Digital Object, Regrets on the Quickening of Quick Time. Please welcome Vivian Sobchack.
Thanks. If I stick this here, is that okay? All right. Okay, I'm going to be doing something fairly unusual today, and my title is Playful and Ironic, because the notion of nostalgia for a digital object, I mean, on one hand, seems kind of ludicrous, and on the other, it makes absolute sense since anything we make is already obsolete given the changing technology and the kind of utopian and dystopian visions of the future that seem to quickstream from any kind of discourse on the digital. I want to begin, though, I'm going to be making certain connections between QuickTime movies, and I'm specifically here talking about 2D QuickTime because of the time in which they were made when there was no 3D QuickTime. That was, and 3D QuickTime is used now for in other contexts than these original QuickTime works. But I want to make certain connections with a number of other cultural phenomena, and specifically the work of an American artist named Joseph Cornell. And I'd like to know here, just so I have a sense of how much I need to show you, I brought some images along with me here. Whether there are people here who have not seen Cornell's work. Joseph Cornell, he was an American artist who died in 1972, lived in Brooklyn all of his life really, and was a collector of all sorts of cultural detritus that he made into collages and most particularly these extraordinary boxed constructions that are now in museums all across the world. Are there people here? I mean, I'm not looking for, a show of ignorance. That there's no reason why. Okay. Well, I'll show a few of his images. And maybe we can go to, let me get on the other side here. Can we go to that first, the zip drive first? The zip drive first. But I want to see the, okay, open Cornell, please. Okay, and then these are all different. Now, Joseph Cornell worked with, as I said, a whole bunch of different kinds of cultural images. And to give you a sense, open the soap bubble, please, down below where you just were. No, up, down, down, 3. Okay, you got it. This is just, and you'll have to scroll up. So he uses three-dimensional objects as well as various kinds of maps and graphic materials and so forth, and certain kinds of serial repetitions and the like. Okay, that's fine with that. They're very, very beautiful and mysterious. Can we go to Paul and Virginia down towards the bottom there? It's one up from the bottom. Okay, this is both a box and its lid, which uses text. And again, you have three-dimensional objects of those boxes there, and the use also of flat graphics into this space and compartmentalization. Okay, let's go to another one. Let's go to the Lauren Bacall. It's right up at the top. I mean, the Bacall. He was fascinated with movie characters. And what's fascinating here, besides this kind of reliquary and homage to Lauren Bacall, is, again, the use of the repetitions, the divisions of space, and the like. And it's to see this in person, the blue, is just astonishing. You get hints of it here. Let's go back to the other one. All right, there was one other I wanted to read. Oh, okay, go to the Medici. It's over in the left there. Yeah, boy. Again, notions of numericality, uses of graphics, repetition, and grid-like patterns, and so on. And then we'll do one last one. There's a pharmacy there, right in the middle. That's it. His works, which I'll mention as I go along here, I mean, we're literally a series called Pharmacy. And again, three-dimensional, but strange objects, as well as perhaps expected ones. Okay. Now I want to show you, and this is just a sample. I could have picked any number of things, but I also had to have them. And indeed, it's very hard now to find these on the net or advertised, as it were, where you can see them in galleries, where when QuickTime first came out, there were all sorts of possibilities for doing so in terms of looking at discrete works. Can we go to Victoria Movie Player Final? And this does have sound. This is one of our students who now teaches at the University of Manchester. Turn the sound up is fine. Sorry, we can't get the sound louder than that? Yeah. Okay. Something almost happened.
Vivian, who's this piece by?
Victoria Duquette, who was one of our doctoral students, but also worked extensively in the Media Lab.
And the audio, the narrative is like,
It's just sampled from actually advertising and news reports, so that you get a lot of looping, which is part of the point, and so on. This is, I don't want to spend a lot of time fixing this technical equipment, which is why I hate visual aids.
you can just continue.
Okay, well, but the bottom line is, I mean, okay.
Do you want to stop?
Yeah, let's stop it at this point. You have a lot of other art historical images floating across this space, which changes in lighting. You have a lot of this new sound track, which adds up, to a kind of narrative on time and so on, and contemporary culture. And the pixelation that you've just seen, the breakdown of the image into pixel grid type constructions. Let's try one other one, since we're not going to see this one all the way through. And this has a loud yell on it, so maybe that'll work. I'm going to make reference to this later on, and it just makes it easier for you to understand when I say 2 marks jumping, what the hell I mean. Okay, 2 marks jump, it's very short. Okay, let's stop there. I'm sorry the Victoria Duquette thing didn't work all the way through, because it is a cumulative work. We can try it later, maybe. Okay. So let me begin here. Whenever I watch QuickTime movies, a nomination I want to interrogate here and thus keep under quotation, I find myself drawn into someone else's in my computer's memory. I'm sorry, that's really distracting. Okay, so I find myself drawn into someone else's in my computer's memory. Even when the content speaks of the contemporary moment, the form itself is a remembrance of times and things past. Indeed, as QuickTime movies play out and often repeat their brief, ambiguous animations and elusive associative narratives in those little boxes that I used to open on my computer desktop or web browser, the form most frequently evokes from me the kind of temporal nostalgia and spatial mystery I feel not when I go to the movies, but when I try to inhabit the worlds of Joseph Cornell's boxed relics or wander among the enigmatic exhibits in the Museum of Jurassic Technology, or leaf through pictures of the personalized collection of curiosities found in what were called the Wunderkammer, or wonder rooms of the 16th and 17th centuries. Most of all, however, QuickTime movies remind me of Cornell boxes. Both preserve under glass the selected and static fragments of a read-only memory that paradoxically evokes memory as random access. That is, as dynamic, contingent, and associational. Both QuickTime movies and Cornell boxes also do not open out onto worldly horizons of space and time. Unlike big screen live action movies, they draw us down and into their own discrete, enclosed, and nested poetic worlds, worlds recollected and remembered, worlds more miniature, intensive, layered, and vertically deep than those constructed through the extensive horizontal scope and horizontal vision of cinema. Both QuickTime movies and Cornell boxes salvage, and some of the things I'm saying here are coming out of certain characterizations of Cornell's work, salvage the flotsam and jetsam of daily life and redeem it as used material whose recollected and remembered presence echoes with bits and traces of an individual yet collective past, personal memories, narratives, histories that were from the first commodified and mass mediated. And through reverential framing, both QuickTime movies and Cornell boxes construct what might be called reliquaries. They preserve and cherish the fragment, the souvenir, the talisman, the exotic as precious material, and treat the ephemeral object as if it were the rarest heirloom. The rarest heirloom in intense, distilled images that create a remarkable confrontation between past and present. This remarkable confrontation between past and present is furthered by QuickTime's stuttering attempts to achieve real-time movement, or to capitulate to and embrace the temporal and spatial gaps that visibly mark its expressions. While cut-out statues and matted silhouettes, and this you got just a small taste of in Victoria Duckett's work, may float gracefully like collage dreams across photorealist backgrounds that effortlessly warp and melt, live action and real-time balk and stiffen in contrast. Strangely static and consequently moving, the temporal field of QuickTime movies is dreamlike and uncanny, and its animations more effluvial than continuous, full of gaps, gasps, starts, and repetitions, made precious by their small size and scarce memory, which is true both literally and metaphorically. QuickTime movies seem to intensify our corporeal sense of the intensive molecular labor and matter of human and worldly becoming. Thus, they evoke for me not the seamlessly lived and wholly present animation of real-time, big, live-action movies, but rather the half-life of certain time-worn and ambiguous kinetic objects, wooden puppets with chipped paint, forsaken dolls with gaping head wounds or missing limbs, Muybridge-like figures in old flip books, hovering with bravado and uncertainty between photograph and cinema, images of 19th century strongmen or belly dancers, hand-cranked into imperfect action through old kinetoscopes found deep in the dark corners of amusement arcades. What comes to mind as I watch QuickTime movies is not live action and real cinema at all. Instead, I associate them with those forms of animated film that foreground the cinema's usually hidden struggle to achieve the illusion of life, with the works of the likes of Jan Svankmajer or the brothers Quay, in which kinetic objects inhabit miniaturized worlds and achieve a laboriously animated life that somehow, and at some deep and molecular level, reminds us of the labor of our own. Hence, I take particular pleasure in the rumor that the thin-faced master puppet who gets caught up in and subjected to the intense time-encrusted miniature world of the Quay's Street of Crocodiles was modeled, supposedly, after Joseph Cornell, and I don't care if it's true at all. At the risk, then, of sounding retrograde and nostalgic, I don't want QuickTime movies to get any quicker. I also don't want to watch them get any bigger. Furthermore, given the value and pleasure I find in their fragmented temporality and intensely condensed space, I don't want them to achieve the streaming momentum of real-time and live action, measured, although it need not be, against the standard and semblance of commercial as well as just the momentum of cinema. Indeed, precisely because QuickTime's miniature spatial forms and temporal gaps struggle against as they struggle to become cinema, they poetically dramatize and philosophically interrogate the nature of memory and temporality, the values of scale, and what we might mean by animation. In some, I don't want them to become real movies at all. Nonetheless, they will, and even from the time that I've first wrote this, they have. It's just a matter of time and compression and memory and bandwidth before the limitations of the medium in relation to moving images no longer display themselves in their peculiar specificity as different and other, and for many less, than the space-times of cinema or television. Before that happens, however, or as it happens, before QuickTime movies as we see them today disappear altogether, and they are in fact doing so in terms of their availability or people working in them, becoming both an extinct aesthetic form and a computer graphic expansion of cinema and television, I want to consider and celebrate them for what in fact they are and what they suggest. Now, the rest of this paper is divided into sections. And the first is called Refusing, and this will have particular resonance for film students, although I explain it here, Refusing the Myth of Total Cinema. All this is to say that it's a shame that QuickTime movies were ever called movies to begin with. In being so named, their extinction as a specifically discrete and computer graphic form of aesthetic expression was virtually preordained. And this need not have been, yet could it be otherwise? Lev Manovich has made the astute observation that the basic metaphors reified by computer interfaces, metaphors such as the desktop with its files and trash can, or the cinema with its practices of cutting, compositing, and virtual camera movement, are also, and more significantly, cultural interfaces, pre-existing and widespread cultural forms of conceptually organizing and visualizing data borrowed upon by a new medium that, after all, had other options. Consider, for example, the developer's documentation for QuickTime, a set of functions and data structures that permits applications to cooperatively control time-based data. QuickTime itself, we're told, is not an application, but a true multimedia architecture, a specific enabling technology comprised of pieces of software that allows an operating system to handle dynamic media so as to integrate text, still graphics, video, animation, and sound into a cohesive platform. However, this rather open initial description turns proscriptive and reductive, hence the developer documentation that goes on to tell us in QuickTime a set of time-based data is referred to as a movie. Long ago now, André Bazin, the French film critic and classical theorist, wrote an essay called The Myth of Total Cinema, in which he argued that the novel technical discoveries basic to cinematic invention were fortunate accidents, but essentially second in importance to the preconceived ideas of the inventors. That is, and I quote, "In their imaginations, they saw the cinema as a total and complete representation of reality. They saw in a trice the reconstruction of a perfect illusion of the outside world in sound, color, and relief. Thus, the cinema was born out of a myth, the myth of total cinema. And the myth of total cinema still remains, this despite technical discoveries that have allowed the invention of a new medium, one which digitizes, integrates, and in so doing transforms all others. In this regard, as a primary cultural interface with the computer, the cinema and its mythic teleology have, on the one hand, merely carried on and extended, and we see this, moving into VR and immersive environments, hypermedia situations, and extended the representational imagination and realization of cinema from sound and color to relief and then immersion. And on the other hand, blindly or willfully asserted the primacy of cinema, if you're using that as your cultural interface, has asserted the primacy of cinema in the face of its transformation into something else by another medium. Again, the developer's documentation is telling. Its very first sentence, introducing the set of time-based data upon which QuickTime operates as a movie, the documentation nonetheless continues. A traditional movie, whether stored on film, laserdisc, or tape, is a continuous stream of data. A QuickTime movie can be similarly constructed, but it need not be. The movie is not the medium, it is the organizing principle. Here we have the significance of cinema as a primary cultural interface. While its very principles of organization enable a certain comprehensible use of the new medium, they also constrain its capacities and influence the trajectory of its development and practice. Thus, for all that the cultural interface of cinema allows, it also causes a certain blindness to both the phenomenological and material differences between QuickTime movies and cinematic movies. The aesthetic values of the former, QuickTime movies, are measured against those of the latter, and true computer graphic novelty of QuickTime works becomes historically inverted and transformed into a false cinematic primitivism. Hence the desire to make QuickTime movies quicker and bigger, rather than stopping to wonder at and privilege the strangely stalled momentum of their animation and the heightened intensity condensed by their miniaturization and framing. Indeed, I would have much preferred naming QuickTime works memory boxes rather than movies. The notion of a memory box not only evokes Joseph Cornell's work, but also, even more importantly, evokes the essential nature of the new medium that is the fundament of QuickTime's existence, the computer in both its physical form and essential functions. Also, insofar as it refers to a range of diverse containers, from reliquaries to children's treasure boxes to shoe boxes filled with photographs or souvenirs, memory box is a name that insists upon memory's dynamic status as well as the historical transformation of the material conditions of its preservation. The computer and all its extensions constitute nothing less than a fathomless memory box, one that collects, preserves, and allows for the conscious and sometimes unconscious retrieval and remembering the visible recollections of selected fragments of all the possible memories cached in the enormous underground network of past images, sounds, and texts that constitute the utopian totality of a potentially infinite and hyperlinked database. The next section is called Memory Boxes and the Database. In the Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard gently critiques a character in a novel who basks in the solidity and order of his oak filing cabinet. I quote from this novel. Everything had been designed and calculated by a meticulous mind for purposes of utility. And what a marvelous tool. It replaced everything, memory as well as intelligence. In this well-fitted cube, there was not an iota of haziness or shiftiness. Despite its lack of solidity, I sometimes get the same feeling from my computer desktop. It reassures me with hierarchy, with clarity and order, with principled and logical menus, commands, and systems through which I can access vast amounts of information, if not intelligence. This database of information, while unseen, does not seem hidden to me. Rather, it is filed away. At most, it's classified. Rather, it is filed away in folders and more deeply in records and fields. It is rationally organized and always hypothetically available for retrieval and display. Indeed, the well-fitted cube that is my computer gives me access to what seems an infinite store of information, if not knowledge. And I take comfort in the hierarchical logic of its unhazy and unshifty memory of an order quite different than my own. Here is the logical and official organization of the office, of the catalog, the library, the museum, and the stockroom. Here, everything has been designed and calculated by meticulous mind for purposes of utility. Here, I've no sense of the secretive or unconscious. As I've said, at worst, information gets bureaucratically classified, misplaced, or erased. One wouldn't use the word repressed. In sum, the phenomenology of comfort that I sometimes feel afforded by the file cabinet and the database refuses ambiguity, ambivalence, and poetry. Now, that said, there's certainly also a phenomenology of discomfort afforded by the file cabinet and the database, one associated with the inhuman literal-mindedness of the computer's technologic and the bureaucratic imperatives and constraints that go against the grain of the lived experience of human work and communicative practices, in which I sometimes file things in an illogical way and then often can't find them, or I can't think the way the computer has filed them. Now, human memory and its recollections don't compute so neatly. As Bachelard tells us, and this is a quote from Poetics of Space, in this section where he talks about this character in his filing cabinet, a well-calculated geometric description is not the only way to write a box. Some other rationale in phenomenal logic operates also here with such memory boxes as QuickTime or Joseph Cornell's boxes. One more associative than hierarchical, more dynamic than static, more contingent than determined, even when given to us as spectators or users in read-only form. It's search engines driven to the database of the past by a present moment of desire, not utility. This is the eccentric, ever-extensible, yet localized logic of the hyperlink. The contingent nature and function of personal desire, as well as the non-hierarchical and associative logic of the hyperlink, transform the organization and phenomenology of the file cabinet and the database that it represents into something quite other than it was. The file cabinet becomes charged with experience, temporality, and desire, and its hierarchical order becomes jumbled by logically incompatible, if psychologically comprehensible, functions. Following Cornell's description of just one of the file folders relating to his work, we could say that the entire file cabinet is now transformed into, and here I quote Cornell, a diary, journal, repository, laboratory, picture gallery, museum, sanctuary, observatory, key, the core of a labyrinth, a clearinghouse for dreams and visions. And the database, no longer hierarchical, more psychological than logical, its order becomes that of a comprehensive but incomprehensible labyrinth, a vast and boundless maze of images and sounds, dreams and visions, in which one follows, backtracks, veers off, loses oneself in multiple trajectories, all the time weaving tenuous threads of association in the logically pointless and endless teleology and texture of desire itself. Here, the materials of the world are never fixed data or information merely requiring recollection. Here, from the first, they're unstable bits of experience and can only be remembered. The poetic and phenomenological power of both Cornell's and QuickTime's memory boxes emerge explicitly from their relation to a larger totality of material and memorial possibilities. They and their found objects exist not only as fragments of personal experience, but also as emblems of a presence too elusive or too vast to be enclosed in a box. These missing presences crowd the imagination. Thus, in differentiating QuickTime's memory boxes from movies, it bears pointing out that watching a film, I usually don't have a profound sense of all the images that weren't shot or all the stuff left on the cutting room floor. Watching a QuickTime memory box, however, I always feel the presence of an elusive and vast absence, a sea of memories shifting below the surface and in the interstices of what I watch. In other words, I'm always aware of a database that seems effluvial. By virtue of their framing, their miniaturization, their valuation of the fragment, and the slightness and ambiguity of their associational links, both Cornell's and QuickTime's memory boxes point to their own presence as the poignant and precious visible landmarks of an unseen, lost, and incomprehensible field of experience. And what Carter Ratcliffe says of Cornell's memory boxes is equally true of QuickTime's. Ultimately, the mode is enchanted by fragmentariness itself, which serves as an emblem of a wholeness to be found in other times and places. It produces an aura of loss, which is as perfect in its own way as reunion would be, which is the very stuff and construction of nostalgia. The next section is called Frames Within Frames. Yet a mode enchanted by fragmentariness, which serves as an emblem of a wholeness to be found in other places and times and places, cannot stand as a complete description, for we cannot ignore the presence of Cornell and QuickTime's memory boxes and their fragments as themselves containers. Furthermore, their miniature size, their collector's sensibility, and the discretion of their enclosures gain particular power from and exist always against their own containment by a larger and marked visual field. Both externally and internally, Cornell and QuickTime works provoke a structural and poetic tension between two different logics, one represented by the hierarchical and rational organization of the file cabinet and computer desktop or browser, where everything has its place in some comprehensive master plan. The other by the associational or organization that is the psychologic of the memory box and the hyperlink, in which everything has a relative and mutable order that as a totality cannot be mastered, that can only be remembered. This tension is simultaneously framing and framed. As a framing device, the larger frame of the museum vitrine or computer desktop or browser allows the smaller frame of the memory box, whether Cornell's or QuickTime's, an intensified condensation and concentration of its visible contents into an aesthetic totality, a personally meaningful and contained microcosm structurally homologous to and nested within the meaningful macrocosm that surrounds them. In this aspect, both Cornell and QuickTime memory boxes take on the magnitude and function, if not the geometric size, of the historical Wunderkammer and Kunstkammer, chambers of curiosity and art, curated less on logic and rational principle than on the personal sensibility and desire of their wealthy collectors. Writing of these condensed historical collections, Anthony Grafton wonders what 16th and 17th century visitors sought in them, and concludes it was the experience of totality and plenitude. He says, they hoped, that is, to encounter the universe in all its richness and variety, artfully compressed into the microscopic form of a single room that showed all the elements, all the humors, all the musical intervals, all the planets, and all the varieties of plant and animal creation. That was the utopian vision here. Neither hierarchically arranged nor meant to serve utilitarian or scholarly purpose, the compressed totality of the Wunderkammer was also not fraught by the implications of its own contingent desire and arrangement, nor was it overwhelmed by its, to our eyes, chaotic clutter. Indeed, historicized, its totalizing impulse can be read as a celebration of mastery, order, harmony, and structural homology. That is, man's comprehension of the universe in all its richness and variety was represented mimetically in a single chamber, complacently nested within the larger frameworks of both the master's residence and God's master plan. Certainly, there are similar compressions and homologies articulated in the smaller Wunderkammer of both Cornell and QuickTime boxes as they emerge structurally and figuratively as both framing and framed within a larger field. But this compression of a homologous universe is apparent also in the content of many, in fact, a disproportionate number of these more contemporary memory boxes. Their multi-layered and rich imagery is marked repeatedly by the recurrence of maps, planetary and astrological charts, hourglasses and clocks and other measuring devices, diagrams and schematics of optical devices from the microscope to telescope, evolutionary and devolutionary biological images of microbes and spores and skulls and skeletons. In some, consistently asserting homologies of shape and structure across scale from the microscopic to the macrocosmic. Much like the Wunderkammer, these memory boxes position themselves as both framing and framed by larger cosmologies and cosmogonies. Nonetheless, times and cosmologies change. While contemporary manifestations of the Wunderkammer may situate themselves in homologous relation to smaller and larger worlds, their relation to totality and its mastery is historically transformed. The assertion of homologies between the micro and macrocosmic is not emblematic of man's security and mastery in Cornell's boxes, and in QuickTime boxes this assertion foregrounds a relativism quite other than the comforting and nested unity of God's master plan. Cornell's references to, as well as containment of macro and microcosmic images, seem nostalgic, indeed elegiac, in relation to a totalized harmony and order. Homologies between ordinary and cosmic objects, thus provoking a sense of the great loss and mystery of perfect comprehension. Here we might remember Radcliffe's description of the boxes as generating an aura of loss, as perfect in its own way as reunion would be. In QuickTime memory boxes, homologies between the micro and macrocosmic are also not about mastery or a sense of security and nestedness. Here, the revelation of self-similarity across scale and structure constitutes a disconcerting, and I use the word purposefully, chaotic relativism, often evoking the vertiginous and non-hierarchical totality of infinite regress and cosmic zooms, and thus undoing an entire hierarchical history that positions and privileges the mastery and rationality of both man and God. Indeed, in QuickTime, it is not God's rational master plan mimetically framing or framed by the memory box open on my computer desktop or browser. Rather, these images of maps, measures, microbes, and constellations mimetically contain and figure and point to the total containment and mastering structure of a more contemporary and secular mainframe, the computer. As suggested earlier, the tension between the two different logics that organize the objects and structure of these contemporary memory boxes emerges not only in the juxtaposed relation between the interior space of the boxes and the external space that frames them. It also emerges framed within the intimate space of the boxes themselves, revealed in imagery that manifests both an appreciation and fear of the associational contingencies, dreams, secrecy, and mysterious material poesy that pervade lived experience and yet often threaten to overwhelm it. Bachelard writes, "For many people, the fact that there should exist a homology between the geometry of the small box and the psychology of secrecy does not call for protracted comment." Nonetheless, it is worth noting that within both Cornell and QuickTime memory boxes, we see a homology literalized again and again. The associational vagaries and hyperlinked debris of contingency, dream, and secret desire overlaid and in palimpsestic relation with the hierarchical and orderly order of the rational file cabinet. Cornell's work, for example, evidences this internal tension even in name. His boxes exist in taxonomic series titled jewel cases, museums, pharmacies, aviaries, and habitats. Furthermore, as Radcliffe notes, when Cornell feels the clutter becoming too oppressive, he sweeps it into those compartmented formats which draw on the orderliness of Victorian cabinetry and the museological devices of natural historians. And you remember the pharmacy one, but you can see pieces of it even in the Bacall. His museums and pharmacies in particular are works which tuck images into drawers and vials and grids. Compartments, grids, drawers, slots, and boxes within boxes. These manifestations of hierarchy and order do not only point to potentially larger and smaller frameworks of organization, so that scale is more than flexible and multiple. Such nesting also frames and contains potentially uncontrollable fragments of temporality and experience that are infinitely extensible in their generation of memory and meaning and secrecy. The same is true of QuickTime's memory boxes, frequently overlaying the image fragments and detritus of their remembered experience, or orderly grids and schematic diagrams, geometry in the form of mats that segment and compartmentalize. And more specific to the particular medium, this compartmentalization and grid work point not only to the larger order and framework of the surrounding desktop, but also to the smaller geometries and hidden secretive orders of microchips, bits, and bytes. That is, remembered experience in QuickTime is often bitmapped and pixelated, as you saw just briefly, but it happens quite often in Victoria's piece. Boxed fragments of photorealist images are fragmented and further and compartmentalized as well into smaller boxes yet, unresolving the personal meaning and contours of human memory and resolving them as the visible and controlled geometry that informs the computer's underlying memory and structuration. There is then, both without and within QuickTime and Cornell memory boxes, the tension between two kinds of logic and order and between a desire for recollection and for remembering. Memory itself is thus generated and acted by both box and viewer as a multi-stable phenomenon, one echoed in a layered and palimpsestic structure and imagery that together provoke a richly poetic ambivalence and ambiguity. On the one hand, the geometry of compartments and mats and pixels recollect and contain the amorphous and ever-extensible material of experience. On the other, the composited and collaged accumulations and associations of this experiential material always also challenge the neatness of recollection with the ambiguity of remembering. And we are reminded there is a radical difference between a pharmacy and a treasure box, between a computer's memory and our own. Bachelard tells us indeed two kinds of, in talking about in his Poetics of Space, the relationship between spaces, two kinds of space, intimate space and exterior space, keep encouraging each other, as it were, in their growth. Thus we could say, according to Bachelard, that the two kinds of space, intimate and exterior, that frame and are framed by Cornell and QuickTime memory boxes gain poetic power through their juxtaposition and layering. Indeed, they do keep encouraging each other, as it were, in their growth. The next section is called Little Movies, Memory, Miniaturization, and Compression. Arguing cinema as a primary cultural interface in our engagement with the digital, Lev Manovich has used QuickTime to make a series of what he calls little movies that employ classic cinematic imagery as the raw material of a digital exploration that interrogates the difference between these media. Furthermore, all 6 of his little movies privilege and foreground the limitations of computer memory and storage space under which they are constructed and by which they are constrained. Appearing in only a small portion of the lower third of the black background, itself framed within the computer screen by the web browser, all 6 variously explore and emphasize their miniature size and compressed nature. In this regard, one called a single pixel movie is particularly striking. To a quite literally loopy tune, reminiscent of Laurel and Hardy's theme music, we watch the already small square of a primitive movie in which a strong man holding a pole does rote exercises and is intermittently interrupted by the sound of a blip and a digitized circle of light. Both movie and digital blip becoming smaller and smaller and less audible at each interruption until both are reduced to a single pixel on the screen. The effect is more compelling and poignant than the mild comedic repetition of mechanical motion and seesawing music would seem to warrant. That is, we watch more and more intently as the already miniaturized image becomes smaller and smaller, and we are aware throughout of the increasing fragility and impending disappearance, not only of the oblivious optimism of the strongman and early cinema, but also of the quick-time movie presently being extinguished from our human sight. It's no small thing that these little movies are small, both spatially and temporally. As Bachelard writes, it must be understood that values become condensed and enriched in miniature. Susan Stewart, who follows on Bachelard, also notes of the miniature in a wonderful book called On Longing, Narratives of the Miniature, the Gigantic, the Souvenir, and the Collection. A reduction in dimensions does not produce a corresponding reduction in significance. Indeed, quite the opposite, pointing it out that we should lose all sense of real values if we interpreted miniatures from the standpoint of the simple relativism of large and small. Bachelard writes, a bit of moss may well be a pine, but a pine will never be a bit of moss. The imagination does not function with the same conviction in both directions. Thus, QuickTime movies, or as I prefer, memory boxes, not only emerge from and allegorize the present objective necessities and constraints of data storage involving digital memory and compression, but they also accrue phenomenological and aesthetic value as an effect of these necessities and constraints. Objectively, the miniature is a compression and condensation of data in space, but phenomenologically and poetically, the compression and condensation that is the miniature in space intensifies the experience and value of the data and makes of it something rare and precious, something spatially condensed, yet temporally interiorized and thus vast in its own way. Furthermore, the miniature exaggerates and tends to exaggerate interiority. In QuickTime, not only the interiority of the individual perceiving subject, but also of the computer itself. A digital version, we could say, of the incredible shrinking man, the strong man exercising in Manovich's A Single Pixel Movie, is extinguished from human vision but not from the computers. While in the mind of God there is no zero, I'm referring here to that wonderful, incredible shrinking man in its last line, in the memory of the computer there is always zero and always also one. Thus, as Stewart suggests, that the world of things can open itself to reveal a secret life, indeed to reveal a set of actions and hence a narrativity and history outside the given field of perception is a constant daydream the miniature presents. The miniature then is always to some degree secretive, pointing to hidden dimensions and unseen narratives. Its nestedness within a larger whole draws us not only beyond its frame, but also into and beneath it. In this aspect, the miniature is transcendent, its metaphoric world making everyday life absolutely interior and exterior to itself. One gets this sense of transcendence and the interiority of history and narrative viewing QuickTime's little movies in Cornell's small boxes. Thus, both QuickTime and Cornell's memory boxes, miniaturized, become not only sanctifications of the small object, but also constitute an infinity of atmospheres within a small space. In sum, the spatial condensations of Cornell and QuickTime and their framings within the frame constitute an interiority that transcends quotidian daily space and temporal relations, and as an object consumed, their miniaturization finds its use value transformed into the infinite time of reverie. In the interior chambers of the memory box, now excluded by their physical size, both artist and viewer imaginatively prospect and inhabit the space they see, filling it with their own missing presence and fragments of autobiography, dream, memory, confession. Speaking, for example, both to us and to its maker, one QuickTime miniature superimposes over a vague, empty, and receding hallway. This happens at the end of the Duquette film, the following textual reverie. Here is the solitude from which you are absent. Thus, whether in my sight or not, the strong man of Manovich's little movie will exercise forever in the depths of my and the computer's memory. Unlike my engagements with cinema, I never quite have the sense that QuickTime movies are ever really over. Indeed, their terminus is ever really under. Thus, Cornell, although he used slots, drawers, and compartments to contain and control the materials of overwhelming experience, he also used them to draw us inward into an ever-extensible reverie, the compartments, according to no rational or logical sequence, further housing and condensing private and sometimes nearly unfathomable associations, almost like a metaphor for the cells of the unconscious mind. QuickTime tends to do the same. Here, in the space-time that is the miniature and the reverie it provokes, as Bachelard tells us, the poet inhabits the cellular image. The next section is called Mnemonics, Reverie, and Reliquaries. The miniature memory boxes of QuickTime and Cornell memorialize fragments of past experience in all their secretive interiority and mystery. In framing and effect, they act as reliquaries, preserving under glass remnants and souvenirs that gain power from partiality, but also from the precious nature of the box's own small size. As discussed previously, to a great degree, the valorization of the contents emerges through a valorization of the container. Hence, the fragment and the miniature encourage each other, evoking the singular, the rare, the fragile, the ephemeral, and the compressed as materially and poetically valuable. Manovich makes little movies that his texts suggest will disappear, the artifacts of the early days of digital media. Bachelard privileges treasure chests and caskets, and Cornell creates jewel cases and places some of his compositions under bell jars as if holding captive a moment in a transient, enclosed world. The preciousness articulated here also emerges from the particular kind of contingency that informs the artfully arranged but found objects of the memory box. That is, we encounter these remembered objects as objective recollections that have been subjectively assembled according to ephemeral associations, the very slightness of the links among them making their present appearance seem singular, fragile, fleeting, and thus precious. Stewart, writing of the material fragments of the past gathered in photograph albums or collections of antiquarian relics or souvenirs, points out there is no continuous identity between these objects and their reference. And any of you have any collections of souvenirs from a bunch of places, I mean, think how disconnected it would be to someone without your memory. Only the act of memory constitutes their resemblance, and is in this gap between resemblance and identity that nostalgic desire arises. This sense of the tenuous and fleeting associations of memory leads not only to a nostalgic desire, but also to a desire to preserve the associations, to keep them in mind. Thus, these memory boxes tend to contain and enact what I would call a mnemonic aesthetic. This aesthetic both practices and privileges devices and operations that serve to fix and preserve the fleeting ephemera of memory, to pin them down and put them under glass, as are the gloriously colored butterflies one sees fixed in the vitrines of natural history museums. Such mnemonic practices are all based on repetition and rhythm, and in the memory boxes of both Cornell and QuickTime can be seen in a variety of forms and modes, such as rote quotation and mnemonic cliches, looping, duplication, and cyclical recurrence or repeated uses of images, objects, and sounds, rhythmic and repetitious patterning of images, objects, sounds, and music, whose modes can be ritualistic, mantric, or mechanical. All these devices and modes are mobilized in a concentrated effort to keep hold of a memory that keeps threatening to slip away and vanish. We can certainly see this aesthetic in Cornell and QuickTime's boxes. What Radcliffe observes in Cornell's work can also be observed in QuickTime. To duplicate an image endlessly is often to make its spell all the more binding. The use of the term binding here in relation to duplication and repetition is telling, for it expresses the desire to preserve what escapes preservation, to tie the ephemeral down without undoing its ephemerality. It expresses the desire to remember. Both QuickTime and Cornell boxes are also highly citational. That is, they don't only attempt to fix personal memories through serial repetition, but they also quote and repeat previous artifacts of cultural memory, especially privileging those that speak mnemonically to technologies of reproduction and preservation. Hence, both QuickTime and Cornell memory boxes are deeply involved with the photograph, the postcard, the photocopy, and the printed reproductions of works of art. You saw some of those briefly in Victoria's work. In addition, the boxes are also marked with great frequency by repeated art historical images that reference the past, well-known paintings, old lithographs, classical statuary. In QuickTime, to an extraordinary and remarkable degree, sound is also used mnemonically. That is, it marks time in repetitive patterns and in musical form, is generally less melodic than it is insistently rhythmic. While often voiced literally in fragments, it is often also looped, repeating a partial thought, setting up a percussive rhythm of mechanical repetition, scratching or stuck in a temporal sonic groove, as if in an old phonograph record, creating a mantra. Indeed, what's odd here is Middle Eastern and Indian music are used to a striking degree, particularly given the often unrelated cultural imagery being remembered to the music. The boxes then use repetition and rhythm in their attempts to grasp and preserve the ephemeral fragments and fragile relics of memory. They construct mnemonic rituals of remembering, and as Radcliffe notes, ritual is mechanical, so any ritualizing aesthetic must have the power to mechanize the artist's meanings. This mechanization is particularly compelling in QuickTime, for the boxes convey an intellectualized notion of serialization. That is, the duplication and repetition as ritualized in QuickTime's memory boxes often seem both mechanical and alchemical. That is, duplication and repetition in QuickTime derive much of their poetic power from mimesis. The boxes duplicate and repeat their memory fragments as figural repetitions of the functional capacities of the computer itself to duplicate, copy, and paste. Here, the mnemonic aesthetic emerges not only from a desire to preserve scarce and rare memory, but also from the ritualized and routinized or mechanical capacity of the computer to do the same. In one QuickTime work, and I showed you that, 2 marks jump, for example, serial images are stutteringly animated as duplicated and endlessly looped image of 1 mark or 2 marks, accompanied by 1 mark, accompanied by a duplicate image of himself leaping into and out of a scene, accompanied by a similarly looped and endless yell. Here, the titular description of 2 marks is belied by the rote duplication of an infinite series of 1. Another example, which I didn't show you, I don't have on here, is called Homage to Magritte, and I've taken these things off the web. They're no longer up there. Homage to Magritte duplicates and transforms the artist's emblematic bowler hats, but also mechanically animates his famous painting Golconde, in which dozens of indistinguishable little bourgeois men in similar hats rain down upon a sterile townscape. In QuickTime, memory boxes, mechanical serialization, and mnemonic repetition often combine, each encouraging the other to keep in mind, to recollect and represent the ephemera of memory that would otherwise disappear from view. Now, the last section is called Time, Movement, and the Illusion of Life, and there's a brief PS after it. The miniature encourages the phenomenological experience of intensity, interiority, and material preciousness by virtue of its compression and condensation of data in space. But the miniature also affects our sense of time. As Stewart points out, there is a phenomenological correlation between the experience of scale and the experience of duration. That is, time also compresses and condenses in the miniature. It thickens in significance and implodes. Constrained or nested in small spaces, time is reflexive. It falls back upon itself and encrusts, building up into the weight of a generalized past, or it collapses under its own weight, diffusing the present into an ahistorical and infinitely deep state of reverie. Furthermore, unlike in real-time and live-action cinema, our sense of temporality, as we engage the miniature, never streams toward the future. And this is so even when movement is involved. Temporal compression and condensation conflict with forward movement and lifelike animation. As a result, as Stewart notes of it, the miniature always tends toward tableau rather than toward narrative, toward silence and spatial boundaries rather than towards expository closure. Fragments and bits and traces of past experience exist now in our sight and reverie, not only evocative but also emblematic of irrecoverable originary moments of wholeness. These broken and poignant and quite thickened units of time and their tableau-like presence point to both the passage of everyday life from particularity into allegory and to the great temporal mysteries of matter's slow and inexorable emergence and extinction. In this regard, we might remember the tendency of the memory box to figure and often make thematic cosmological imagery, suggesting not human temporality, but the imperceptible dynamics and perspectives of what's been called longue durée, an almost immobile history, written not in human events, but in the cosmic temporality of geologic or climactic or astrological transformations. And astronomical transformations. There is then an extraordinary obfuscation and questionable utopianism in the name QuickTime. QuickTime is anything but quick. Its animations are forestalled, its illusion of life incomplete, compressing and condensing its imagery in a miniature number of bits of digital memory and display space. The material conditions that inform QuickTime's miniature memory boxes, material conditions which have drastically changed even since I wrote this, are literally dramatized in the half-life of its objects. Not only are these objects constituted as fragments in space, they're also fragmented in temporality and motion. Indeed, even when they take human form, the animated subjects of QuickTime are experienced as partially discontinuous and without agency. Broadband will do completely away with that. At best, like the puppet Pinocchio, they struggle against their existence as mere kinetic objects, in frustrated fits and starts, stuttering out the desire to become a real boy, that is, fully alive in the temporal continuity and spatial coherence of intentional and realized action. My evocation of Pinocchio here is hardly coincidental to the temporal and spatial qualities of both the miniature and the memory box. The way in which both together transform time and space and thus question the nature of human animation and agency seems to call up both puppets and theater, subjects whose lives are directed from without, and a space which miniaturizes, condenses, and foregrounds the illusion of life. Indeed, in both QuickTime and Cornell memory boxes, the theatrical stage is very frequently evoked, particularly puppet theaters with cut-out cardboard scenery, with the framings that have had in cardboard or flat pictures circling across. Moving across. Central also here is intermittent motion, time and action broken into fragments, foregrounding gaps, and the laborious struggle to become really real cinema. In this regard, Pinocchio's Bildungsroman of self-realization is countered with the oxymoronic miniaturization and intermittencies that undo cinema within cinema in such uncanny films made by Jan Svankmajer or the brothers Quay. Indeed, Cornell's own forays into filmmaking were meant to undo live action and real time. He insisted that his Rose Hobart, shot at sound speed, 24 frames per second, and using fragments of a 1931 sound melodrama called East of Borneo, he insisted that Rose Hobart be projected at silent speed, 16 to 18 frames per second, to the accompaniment of scratchy phonograph recordings. In Cornell and QuickTime memory boxes, intermittent motion is always more than merely mechanical. It also articulates the temporal and existential conundrum of discontinuity. Thus, in Cornell's kinetic constructions, such as his sand fountains, one critic tells us the sand was deliberately mixed with some larger impurities so that the flow was supposed to be somewhat discontinuous rather than like an egg timer. In a QuickTime work like one called Self-Portrait, again by Duquette, which shows a naked little girl running, but not, over a background of repetitious forms, merely figures and foregrounds the discontinuity informing both QuickTime and the medium, where the selected fragment and the digital bit are animated discretely, discontinuously, in tableau time. In sum, movement in both Cornell and QuickTime memory boxes becomes emblematic as it condenses and compresses momentum into a series of reified and frozen moments, but not quite. The effortless and continuous animation of life becomes temporally solidified, but not quite, in what we might call a kinetic souvenir, a memory of motion that is now merely its token. Connecting the souvenir with the disjuncture between the past and present, Stewart tells us that it speaks to a context of origin through a language of longing, and arises out of the necessarily insatiable demands of nostalgia. That is, the souvenir, she says, generates a narrative which reaches only behind, spiraling in a continually inward movement rather than outward toward the future. Both QuickTime and Cornell boxes are in the end always engaged as tokens of memory, indeed as souvenirs. Both Cornell and QuickTime boxes mobilize very differently in their historical moments, but nonetheless through the same strategies and impulses, mobilize memory and desire through an aesthetics of absence, a privileging of the poetically and philosophically charged gap between a present artifact and the past experience of which it is only a fragment. In closing, it's worth noting, even as we know that Pinocchio became a real boy and that QuickTime is already seamlessly streaming into live action, I just lost my place. Okay. That, you know, I'm trying to find. That, as Stewart suggests, the point of desire which the nostalgic seeks is in fact the absence that is a very generating mechanism of desire. Call me retrograde. As the gap closes and QuickTime enlarges and quickens, I thus feel nostalgia, bourgeois subject as I am, as well as critical of it, at the impending loss of a unique historical experience and a rare and precious digital object. Thank you.
There are any questions? Could
Thanks
you
for
please
sitting around
use the
waiting
mic?
with the confusion.
Well, are you going to show some photos now?
I could, if you want to. I mean, I don't know what your time. You want to see, those of you? It's our see some stuff. Some of the QuickTime that I, you know. You're intrigued by the descriptions. Okay, can you put up the? Can you put up my the QuickTime the CD? I think it's on the CD. Not the fun. No, let's see. It may be on the other one. I think it's on the zip drive.
Yeah, I'll put that
Yeah.
zip disk.
Okay. Let's look at the God Dog movie. These are really, you know, as I said, just taken off from, they weren't picked for any particular.
Can you play more than one of these at a time? I think that would really get across that Cornell QuickTime analogy that you were talking about.
Except that, well, I don't know if you can do it. I don't think it's done. No.
You guys have never done that?
But it's already done in the sense that here is this, if you start this, I mean, the logic of this construction against the desktop or the browser is really part of the point that I'm making in terms of this space. These two spaces encourage each other. American streaming, had their own aesthetic whether it's projected or not, I mean, certainly there's a greater intimacy when you're sitting in front of your computer screen by yourself than right here in this crowd, sort of crowd anyway.
Well, how do you feel about the streaming video being in QuickTime windows that are still tiny windows, and you have?
I think some of these qualities work, but others don't. I mean, they're doing something different. I mean, certainly the idea of the miniature, but the desire to see them. I mean, the closer they try to be the real movie,
right.
The more irritating,
right.
if what your expectations are is that it's a real movie, yeah. The more frustrating they become rather than poetic works in which you lose yourself in reverie. And the issue of motion, I think, here is very central.
So, for instance, right now you're streaming in real time, but at the same time...
You mean me personally, or the way you're recording me?
So we're being streamed right now, and your picture, well, now you're in the dark, but you have been streaming and there have been people watching you in real time. At the same time, in parallel, we're archiving that stream and capturing it. And in an hour, you can have the memory
right.
of the past moment that can last for years.
Well, you can have the memory.
Yes,
the memory. Right.
In a quick time window, right? So what I'm saying is, how do you extend what you're saying to a moment like what is just happening now
here.
That's being put into a quick time window?
I think part of the difference is the distinction I sort of make between recollecting and remembering. The kind of poesy, I mean, any poesy, that came out of my lecture was probably Bachelard's. Again, I mean, what I think happens, and I haven't, seen your particular streaming, and streaming itself is questionable because a lot of streaming is not really achieved, does not really achieve seamless kind of real movement in terms of the way we think of live action movies.
Depends on the bandwidth.
That's exactly. But the less the bandwidth, if you have those slight temporal gaps, I mean, they get smaller and smaller, obviously, with increased bandwidth. The less these gaps exist as a kind of place of insertion in another mode. Instead, okay, I'm watching a lecture, or I'm watching my lecture, rather than having a space in which I can contemplate animation itself, or movement and the like. Now, one can see that obviously as an irritant. A lot of this has to do with the function of whatever it is. I mean, if it's to take notes and remember a class lecture or something, what the hell do you want with intermittent gaps, On the other hand, in terms of an aesthetic form, I mean, the larger point that I'm making here, and it's really quick, I mean, it's really hard, I think, to pin down because of the changing technology. I mean, the absolutely rapid obsolescence that goes on with digital media is that, I mean, Rudolf Arnheim in film, at a certain point, even today, students laugh at him because he bemoaned the coming of sound film and color and kept saying the art is in the limitations, the frame. And the minute you start adding these things that take you more and more into the kind of copying of, at least on the surface, of what looks like the real life. I mean, whatever the normative notions of that, the less kind of aesthetic kind of foregrounding there's going to be, and a certain level of imagination and aesthetic originality is going to be lost. Now, that's an extreme statement. And there are others who've said, the more kinds of opportunities we have, you know, for both streaming and QuickTime. I mean, streaming just adds to the arsenal of what QuickTime might be if you had a really, at this point, primitive computer. And we're working on this. The problem is the culture in which we live and the kinds of, again, cultural metaphors or cultural interfaces, as Lev Manovich talks about them, in a way constitute frameworks in which we want a real movie on our digital screen, or most people do. And the kind of commodification that attaches also to the medium and the like will tend to overpower. I mean, this is not new in art making, but nonetheless, I think is particularly pressured by the rapidity with which this technology changes and the desire for the new thing, whatever it happens to be. So that part of what I find so interesting is, you know, just sort of looking at these forms in their own sort of moment of creation and what they're able to do. And it would be a shame not to sort of recognize some very profound things that they do. Much more so, I mean, I think they say more about the computer graphics and the construction of computation itself than a streaming lecture, which don't lead us to sort of think about the kind of fragments and the bit and the, you know, pixelation and the frames within frames. So that's, you know, I mean, the basic argument I would make. We should look at these things.
So QuickTime is an Apple product, and of course Steve Jobs is in love with the movie industry and wants to have the iMovies and the iMac. Anybody can make their movie.
Anybody can make a movie.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think anybody should make a movie. But yeah, sure. I actually had gotten out of it purposely so I could see people. Okay, but now I suppose I can see you as well. It was just up there. I couldn't see anybody. Okay, it's real democratic, right, supposedly. And I remember being at a digital conference where a grad student at MIT stood up and she was talking and really enthusiastic and utopian. And she said, just think, everybody in the world can have a web page. And out of my mouth, I mean, I just, under my breath, but it was a little louder than that, unfortunately, I said, what an appalling idea. I mean, do you want to watch other people's home movies? Home movies, I mean, we're dealing, certainly home movies are a form, and they have their own aesthetic, and they have their own functions, which don't necessarily work for the person who has to sit and endure them. And in fact, I mean, it's interesting that for all the kind of Mac notion of, oh, you can, you know, which suggests all sorts of forms of narrativization, that now you have the tools, you know, to make a real movie and construct it in such a way that it's interesting rather than boring. Okay, here's the seashore, and now there's the dog in the yard, and so forth. That even with movies, let alone the computer, people tend generally not to create narratives out of QuickTime. I mean, out of their home movies. They tend to act very much like, again, tokens of a past time that either evoke memory or a much more complete situation than the film ever could, which is why they're boring to other people very often, because you have no means with which to evoke the surrounding narrative that was, as it were. So I think there is, again, it's all commodified. Jeff Goldblum, you know, doing his number with "You too, Dad," you know, and this will make you a better father or something. But I mean, people are using it certainly as an archive. I mean, I think that's true. But an archive is not necessarily a poetic work. So I think that's where it really comes in. So now you have your digital photographs, and you have your digital movies, and you can put them all in a convenient place. But are they changing in form? I mean, that would be an interesting question, actually, to go research. My general sense so far is no, they're not changing in form. But perhaps somebody has seen a whole, you know, I mean, I'm talking about large numbers, but they very well may. Yeah, John?
Much about the how the context affected the impact or the perception of Cornell's works, for example. These to me, they seem to be particularly powerful because they were taken out of a vernacular environment and put in a white-walled,
museum,
holy
right.
museum. And it was shocking, and a lot of the preciousness resulted because of the context it was put into. Obviously, millions and millions of people collect driftwood and objects, and they have them on their dressers and in cases. So that the context in which Cornell's work was put, I think, had a lot to do with that kind of patina or preciousness. And I'm interested in seeing if you've thought at all about how a broader context of using computers in a home or in domestic environments affects this theory of yours about how QuickTime feels or how we experience it in any sense. I note, for example, that you have used short art films, I would call them, as examples.
Right.
And there's a lot of other uses, obviously, for
There
computers.
definitely are.
And the reason I'm asking that, the emphasis on mnemonic aspects of this are quite intriguing, given the fact that a lot of people have talked about digital media in terms of its presence or simultaneity or noun, something you've written about. It's really kind of an interesting tension, and I'm wondering if that attempt to grasp the past in this is, well, I'm just curious, how you think about that.
Well, I tried, and certainly with all the very lengthy pages of footnotes as well, which you didn't get, to historicize, at least briefly, the distinctions between, let's say, not both the historical distinctions, given the time of their production and reception, although Cornell's reception comes quite a bit after he makes the works, that by bringing up the frames within frames, the museum or the vitrine, relative to that are different than, let alone that the kind of desire being articulated for containment and collection fit within a very different kind of sense of relationship in the present moment with the computer than with QuickTime, Cornell. And so I tried to at least suggest that. As far as what is, I have taken artworks, but they could have been, where does one draw the distinctions there? These were early works made certainly within not just this school, or whatever school, I'm sure it's both schools, but also just off the, finding them, on the web under gallery spaces of people who, even barely got recognized. Some of these were student works, others were not. They were all short, but that was not just an issue at the time of deciding to make a short poetic work. It was a function of not having enough storage space. And if you wanted animation and so forth, the size of the frame was very much relative to how much you could fit on a, with the image, with the compression and the data storage space that you had to make these works. So in a way, there is a kind of technological necessity driving the shape of the work, which is no longer quite as pressing. Now, what the hell is that? Now we have sound? What? I feel like the bell has tolled for me. Death is going to come in the door out of some Ingmar Bergman movie. The question you raised is interesting, because when I went on, knowing I was going to do this talk and everything, and it's been a while, since I've written this. It's published in an obscure but prestigious film journal. That's not that easy to get. And it took a while to actually get published. So, there's all this lag. Is the fact that where at one point I could get on the web and find sites, and what I would find would be these short films or these more poetically inflected works. Now they're very hard to find, and what you find, though, is on websites and various other things, you find the insertion, which has to do, again, of the context of the QuickTime movie in a different context, which tends to be that of the web page or the home page. But it's framed by not, let's say, another, it's maybe framed by another logic, but it tends to be more incorporated into the quotidian, of the web page, or and whatever that aesthetic is. And actually, I think Michael Renov, or at least he either wrote something or he was referred, somebody's done some work on home pages. Do you know?
Yeah, Michael.
Michael has, but also there's someone else he cites as well, which in terms of thinking about them as, a particular kind of form that emerges with the web is also worth doing. I don't want to suggest, I'm not valorizing QuickTime movies particularly, but I think what led me to this project and the book on metamorphing, which was actually conceived well before and mostly written, and it just didn't come out up until this past year, called Metamorphing, on the notion of digital morphing, was not only trying to see a very particular material form of representation put in some sort of historical continuum where it shares certain kinds of impulses or desires, i.e. the desire for transformation here for memory or whatever, to see that not only in a historical continuum, but to look very carefully at that particular form. Because for a long time, a lot of digital cultural criticism around the digital culture and the electronic, and it was a necessity, really, was very broadly based, where we're talking about the electronic and the digital and the computer, to sort of point out a really historic transformation, I think, of our sense of time and space and embodiment. I mean, it's been this radical cultural change. I don't think it's just another move from cinema. It's, I mean, I really would suggest there's a major break, is that we were talking in these large terms, which are not necessarily not illuminating, but at a certain point, the aesthetic forms that emerge, and as I said, they're just so rapidly transforming, I think are worth looking at in their particularity. So that would be the larger argument, I think.
Yeah, I wanted to suggest that QuickTime now has even moved into this radical new kind of VR environment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
In my own work, I've been exploring all, it's QuickTime, but then it's imported into Silicon Graphics environment and used either as movies that are nested in virtual space or become movies that are texture maps. So it again harks back to Cornell and the memory theater and mnemonic devices.
I think some of the VR stuff does that, actually.
But it's interesting how there might be a way of talking about states of media. That's something that I think a lot about, that you make something that has one kind of phenomenological characteristics when it's big and it's projected and it's rarefied in a museum, and you might have that same media that's reproduced on a CD that's low res, but somebody can have it at home and they can see it whenever they want to. And I think they're both valuable experiences.
They both serve different functions. They both are different experientially, but I mean, let's all face it, movies were transformed. I mean, I'm talking about cinema, was transformed not only when it was, put on television, commodified and seen as a product of television, where not only did we see it on smaller screens, but there was scanning and panning, and then the whole bit about colorization and so forth, or edited for television, to fit the time slot and or to get rid of language. But more radically than that, when, that innocent phenomena that everybody has, the VCR came along. In which you could reorder the way you watch, stop, frame, great tool for film scholars, but I mean, it really radically transformed our notion, of what cinema was, because in terms of a temporal spatial formation, it electronically transformed the, motion picture as such. So yeah, I agree with you completely.
As someone who's not in this, his interests are not specifically in the visual arts, I come to this looking to find some kind of human interest. And you talk about cinema and the allure is that it's storytelling. Okay, there's some
That's
kind
one of the allures.
Yeah, and I'm giving a personal,
Right.
opinion. And I'm looking. I try to find that within this quick time, these highly individualized, idiosyncratic palimpsests of images and sound. And I try to find some kind of, it may be interesting to someone who's fascinated by the technology and perhaps even by the very nature of itself. But I'm trying to find what's the transcendent nature to it. What is, you talk about cinema, they tell stories, there's human interest, and that was loosely based on novels, on writing, and writing was based on an oral history, okay, that was passed down. What is the transcendent nature to this that is going to appeal to a broader spectrum of people? I mean, it's the dog barks in the middle of the night, okay, and that's interesting. If you're there to hear the dog bark, all right, but it doesn't have any kind of significance other than that, unless you heard the dog.
Well,
So,
what you're saying could be...
I'm not trying to downplay.
Right.
I'm just trying to figure out, and I'm trying to understand also what it fits into this context of this whole. I don't know if it's a lemmings running to the sea on this internet thing, and we see this thing just crashing. Okay, this incredible fascination with technology, and I see this commercial crashing, everyone losing their money, and I mean the applications just aren't there. And I'm trying to find what the relationship is, and what's the transcendent nature to this besides just its.
Well, I'm not sure what this is. If you're talking about QuickTime, everything you've said could be said about poetry in relation to narrative fiction. And not only, narrative fiction that's very complex or whatever, but, popular narrative fiction that is obviously reaches a broader range of people. If you want to talk about this particular form, when you have the sound and whatever, there is a kind of compelling quality to it, however idiosyncratic, in terms of trying to not just figure out a story, although that's part of it. I mean, it leaves you space to if you will, connect the gaps. But there's also this kind of, as I said, rhythmic, repetitious, looping. I mean, there is a kind of mantric quality to these works, which are extremely poetic, even when their material doesn't necessarily, as I said, have anything to do with certain kinds of rhythmic patterns, or doesn't necessarily, I mean, it can be very contemporary in some cases. So, I mean, different strokes for different folks, but some of these works are very compelling and gain, I would say, a lot of their poesy, I mean, which was part of the pointing to compression, what it does at a poetic level, or the notion of the miniature, or two different kinds of space. I mean, one can always find an object nested in a context. But when we go into a commercial movie theater, we're not drawn to the edges of the frame and watching the exit signs. Here, what you have is, well, unless you're really bored, someone yells fire, or you're watching, as I just showed Derek Jarman's Blue in one of my classes. So certainly, I mean, in terms of, I mean, this is not a commercial form necessarily, but what it does, I mean, what intrigues me about it is not only the kind of poetics of it, or of particular works within it, but of the way that the form itself, by virtue of certain limitations that constrained it, particularly at its beginning, point to larger computational structures. So it's not just, about memory, but it's memory insofar as scarcity. In terms of compression, it takes a very material phenomenon and by necessity in the moment, not just uses that, but is forced to foreground in certain ways, certain aspects of computation in this medium. And I find that very fascinating. Boxes within boxes, grids, fields, I mean, all of those things end up on the surface of these films, as well as gaps, starts the difference between the digital and the analog, which is certainly the difference between cinema and the electronic. So I mean, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, and if you're talking about, you know, our conventions by which we, you know, we tend to, I mean, what movies are showing, how many people are going to see, think of a film. I mean, everyone's going off, you know, to see what? Gladiator, which uses digital stuff, you know.
But that's appealing to kind of a universal kind of quality. I found these very, I guess you're right, it's different strokes for different folks, but that's highly, you know, highly subjective and highly relative.
Well, this is like almost like you were saying earlier about, you know, you wouldn't sit down and be very intrigued by watching someone's home movie. So
Right.
what would compel someone?
To watch someone's home movies.
Sure. And if it's not done with an interesting way and it's not done with good editing, you know, it's like you're talking about Jeff, you know, what's his last name, Goldblum?
Goldblum, the one
Yeah,
who dances
the actor
around
from
on
the,
it.
you know, the thing that product does with Apple is it inspires creativity, and it inspires people to think about, look what I can do. And granted, not everybody can do it, but those that will, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, any Steven Spielberg is his home movie, you know. I mean, so, but he's got the money to do good production. He's got still home movies. Yeah. But, you know, so I think that's what this gentleman was talking about is, you know, what would compel someone to do that? What would make them do it? And would they do it in such a way that it would be of interest for me to watch, and what would I get from it? You know, what is the basis that that's done on? Okay.
But I think it raises larger questions, because one of the things that's going on right now, and it very much is part of, you know, commodity culture, is there are all of these websites that are making deals with like film schools and the like to put stuff on the web. The AFI a long time ago put a whole bunch of silent stuff on and so forth. And they are and at first they were miniaturized, okay, because of the fact, and they still are, you know, to great degree. One could say, who really wants to watch movies, you know, on the web? Why? I can go out and get a DVD, which is a little better, or my God, I could go to the theater and see it on a really big screen, you know. There are things you win and things you lose. I have to listen to everybody talking, you know, if I go to the theater. But the interesting thing, I think, is that even those initial kinds of broadcastings have their own kind of discretion, if you will, as a form that tells us something both about the medium and about the transformations that occur through the different kinds of mediations of the technologies themselves, where cinema gets transformed in varying ways. So perhaps because of my particular, you know, interests as a media scholar and the like, I'm more interested than, you know, looking at these than you would and thinking about their forms.
This is Lake Wobegon. Is everything above average? Are there good?
Oh, there's crap. No,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
There's
Yeah,
good
I
art
mean,
and there's bad
good,
art.
bad, and different. But then, you know, we could debate, and that I think becomes subjective and idiosyncratic up to a certain, extent, and others, everybody would probably agree. As I've said, you know, everybody could have a web page, but
doesn't mean it's a good
doesn't
web
mean
page.
it's good, you know. And so you know, what I'm trying to sort of get at here is we're all sort of rushing. You mentioned whether crashing and burning or moving into, you know, the utopian future. I mean, both of those stories are sort of millennial, one way or another, catastrophe or utopia. I mean, it's always going to be someplace in between, which is like real life, you know. These things are happening so rapidly, I think we can find out things about what is happening by looking at these forms. Good, bad, or indifferent, you know.
Has anyone made any effort to preserve a simulation software so that artwork that's done in this early QuickTime
question.
process can be reconstructed in the future? And if they haven't, do we
Do
have
you know
to?
the answer to that, Victoria? Because that's a really good
Well,
question.
I would say that the artists that create them save them. But if anybody has interest in collecting these,
It's the
Is the
software
real-
to play it
Yes.
that we have to be
No,
very
there's a
careful that we
wonderful-
don't lose.
I don't know who gets the New Yorker here regularly, but several years ago, there was a wonderful, wonderful article, much of it an interview and discussion, with a guy at the Library of Congress who handles all of the sort of old versions of the, phonograph and the movie camera and whatever else. And there are obviously certain rolls of, paper film and various other, the wax recordings and whatever else. But he was making the observation that not only did these things become almost completely obsolete, but that we're moving into a stage where miniaturization of the technology itself suggests, from his experience with stuff that he's gotten, that what was made for mass reproduction and play was becoming, you needed to calibrate it so carefully that unless you, for example, played whatever it was on the machine which it was recorded on, and we all know sort of versions of this when you try and queue up a VCR on someone else's machine, doesn't work the same way. It's sort of in the same ballpark, sometimes it's way off. But he was pointing out that even with all of the sophisticated machinery, there's going to get, there was all of this stuff sitting there in the Library of Congress with the, that couldn't play what it was supposed to.
I think we should do something about that. Surely we've learned from the things we've lost in the past what happens. And it's much easier and cheaper to simulate digital and computer equipment, programs, and technology than it was, for example, to machine out a Powers projector or something like that. So if we see what happened in the past, surely now we ought to start
Why are we any
putting those
wiser?
things aside. Pardon?
Why are we any wiser? Let alone, even if we were, where's the money come from and where does it go?
Well, it shouldn't be going to too much bureaucracy, and it should be going to lots of preservation.
I agree with you completely, but what are the two of us going to do?
You're making the argument that it should be preserved just for the sake of being preserved.
Yes.
Well, I'm not so sure you should, it's not a...
It's not an artistic judgment. It's
Yeah.
At the very least, it's a cultural judgment of preserving a past, not necessarily singling out the best work.
People should have the option. If they don't like it, they don't have to run it.
He may, listen, what really started the
Bill
preservation...
Gates is definitely not preserving QuickTime.
No, not QuickTime. But, again, what's interesting, we're not dealing with totally black and white phenomena here of extremes, because what's fascinating is you can go through this whole kind of capitalist deconstruction of, the emergence of these commodified things called VCRs and the demise, what that did to the art house cinema, and a whole range, of different exhibition practices. The emergence of films on, earlier, the emergence of films on television. There were studios that could have cared less about their collections, and, if you ever wanted to get a still for a movie, who would you contact? Could you even get anybody? There was very little interest. Lots of films got burned, and destroyed because of that. The minute it was realized they were a commodity, that's when the preservation movement gained momentum. And, why are more things being preserved now? It's not just a nostalgia trip, although that's part of it in a postmodern moment in which, the past was 10 minutes ago. You realize nostalgia keeps getting shorter and shorter. People are now nostalgic for the 90s. The fact that, there's product here. And, you restore this film or that film for commercial exhibition, that's no small thing, because there are all of those screens and multiplexes out there which are now closing down. So there is a whole economic reality that on one hand, we can see as being really deleterious to putting money in preserving culture and so forth. On the other hand, it's also putting money preserving culture. So it's, I mean, there's a kind of tension there that exists. I mean, I don't want to valorize the major impulses of our contemporary moment. I do think we're, you know, rushing like lemmings somewhere.
Well, yeah, it gets narcissistic. At some point it becomes navel-gazing, it becomes narcissistic. How much do we want to catalog our lives?
Are there any librarians in the crowd? I was going to say something. Yeah,
No,
Lisa was here earlier.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, we could do a lot of hand-wringing about preservation, but the fact is, every major corporation that has a holding, that has a collection of film and television, is in fact interested now in what they call their legacy
Right.
holding. Syndication now means that all of these films and television programs have an endless life to them. And when I went to the Digital Library of Congress meetings, you know, the heavy hitters there were not the academics like myself who were arguing for this. They were the people from CBS and NBC and Warner's that were talking about millions and millions of dollars worth of films that they had to ensure would be infinitely playable.
Right. Because?
Right. Yeah, financial reasons, obviously, and what they have the financial ability to do is to constantly remaster up. Right now in Hollywood, everything's going to HD TV in the post houses. In 5 more years, there will be something else. Kodak is still telling people 35 millimeter is the legacy format for all of your work for this kind of endless syndication. It's people like Electronic Arts Intermix in New York who have their half-inch EIAJ tape reel-to-reel players, and they have, you know, one-inch player who are desperately trying to keep those kind of art forms available. So capital is actually very important in the process, and a lot more is actually being saved now because people realize these ancillary markets are endless than were, I think, when
Earlier, yeah.
where they didn't see it that
It was
way.
some like, you know, the Society for Cinema Studies, you know, which didn't even do preservation or drives by the particular archives, and who could care? You know, it was a handful of people, you and me, you know, or something like that. Now it's a, you know, it's big money. And so I'm not, again, I mean, we can over-valorize that, but we're not dealing with black and white structures, but actually much more is being saved right now. And Ted Turner, you know, the person we vilified for, you know, colorizing movies. There's also Turner Classic Movies, which happens to be one of the very few venues where you can actually see silent films. Or films that, you know, you wouldn't even know you could rent anywhere, and perhaps can't. So there's pluses and minuses here, you know.
Also with the computer, I mean, in terms of QuickTime Movie, there are all of these interactive works that are authored in a particular kind of software and so on. 10 years later, the artist goes, well, should I lock it off and it only plays on this CD-ROM from that time and that's what it was? Or do you continuously re-author it, which is very different than just dubbing up to a higher format?
Right.
It's really having to remake the thing, basically.
I mean, but that's I mean, that's embodied in the most everyday experiences. I got a G4, and stupid me, I thought there would be, you know, along with the DVD player and everything else, there would be, you know, a little thing I could stick my diskettes into from the previous computer I had. So I had the option. I mean, I was kind of disappointed. It just never occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to use this thing on this computer unless I bought additional components. And, you know, the notion, everybody said, what do you need that for? You can send it over the web. Well, that's not necessarily true, you know, for publishing, formatting, and various other things in compatible systems. And but you know, you feel like a dinosaur, and there's a point. I have a, like, what was the cutting edge 170 Mac PowerBook, you know, sitting in a room. I have it plugged into the wall as if I'm going to use it, you know. And, it sort of sits there as this strange old artifact, you know. So, and that's the most common kind of thing, but it works at much more significant levels, I think, in terms of, you know, preservation and so on. How many computers am I going to keep? How many different variants of being able to work with you know, different applications and whatever. I mean, that's that guy in the Library of Congress bemoaning, you know, not being able to play this stuff. So this kind of technological change, I mean, we're really in a very interesting moment. Anyway, can I have some more wine?
Yeah, I think at this note we'll
Yeah.
end, and thank you so much. God, this is the most patient audience. You're just
Yeah,
wonderful.
thank you. I mean,
Really,
sorry
thank
about the
you.
mix-up, but it wasn't me.
I'd like to invite you to next Monday's lecture. We're having another gem from our campus. I consider Vivian to be a gem. Catherine Hales, who's from English,
that's great.
is another gem, and she'll be speaking along with Eduardo Katz, who's coming to us from the Chicago Art Institute, and he creates transgenic art. His latest piece is a fluorescent bunny, which has caused a lot of controversy in bioengineering and bioethics. So do come and join us for that one, and it's at 6 o'clock.
Thank you very
Thank you
much
for coming.
staying. I mean,